Good evening. My name is Dan Klingensmith. I am the host of the Toy Files podcast. Welcome back. I know it's been a minute since I've done any recordings. As most of you know, I've been focusing on getting the creating G.I. Joe books completed over the last few years. So I'm excited to get back into the rhythm of doing these podcasts. I have some great ideas coming up in the future as far as different guests. Again, my goal is to not only talk about G.I. Joe, but other brands, that either Hasbro made or even other toy companies, excuse me, where some of these other gentlemen and ladies had worked at in the past. But tonight, I'm happy to bring on Bob Swanson, former marketing director, and he was a G.I. Joe product manager in the late 80s and early 90s. And so let me bring him on. Bob, welcome.
Hi, Dan. How you doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good seeing you.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yes. And you're avoiding the cold of Rhode Island right now and enjoying the Florida weather, right?
Sunny Florida, nice and warm. Exactly. Yeah. But I do like the fall in New England. So we'll be getting back there for the holidays.
Nice. Well, I appreciate you coming on and kind of relaunching this podcast as far as, getting you guys on here to share your stories and insight as to, your experience with G.I. Joe. And like I mentioned to you prior and to the viewers, hopefully someday bring you on for some of the other products that I'm sure we'll touch upon that you worked on and do something a little bit different. So again, welcome.
Sure.
So as I normally do, a lot of the questions I ask are just about you. Early on, kind of like maybe what inspired you to get into the marketing realm. And then generally I'll hone in on more like Hasbro and G.I. Joe and specific type of questions.
Sounds good.
So first question I always like to ask people, as far as in your position or former positions, how early on in life did you know that you wanted to be in marketing?
Oh, actually, good question. So I think, as I look at myself as a child, I was always interested in sales and marketing. I was always ambitious, wanting a job early, from paper routes to working retail. So early on, I've always had an inkling for wanting to, take and look at a product, look at an idea and find ways to market that idea and get people interested in it and excited about it. And that's probably some of the earlier recollections I have around, taking a product or an idea, even through school and trying to find a market and an audience for that product.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, so is that something you did even through grade school, or is that more like college projects you had to do?
Yeah, more in grade school. I can think of some early school projects where, I've, took a product and made it, an everyday product and made it more saleable, if you will, trying to find new and creative uses for it. And that's really what marketing is all about, is really trying to attract customers and attract target markets to a product that either they didn't know they needed or they wanted, or they do know they needed and wanted, and you're making it more desirable, or you're creating new ways of making it more desirable for the audience.
Now, do you feel like being a marketer, do you also have to have kind of a, the sales aspect, but also a creative mindset? Because like you said, making maybe some modifications to an existing product. Do you think there's some creativity in there as far as like from artistic standpoint, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that creativity is key to a lot of things, right? From, as boring as some people might think, accounting, there's creativity in accounting. There's certainly creativity and lots of creativity in toys and product and marketing in general. So definitely creativity plays a role, a big role in finding those new audiences and looking at products and ideas and trying to figure out, is this product, does it have legs? Does it have the staying power that we're looking for a particular audience, to either attract new audience or make something new and fresh to an existing base of audience.
Awesome. Going back to your childhood, what were some of your favorite toys as a child, and how did they influence any of the decisions you made while working on different toy brands yourself?
Yep. So I was, early on, I was really into cars, Matchbox, Hot Wheels. I born in the 60s, early 60s. So, late 60s, early 70s, Matchbox, Hot Wheels, collector cards like baseball, wrestling, wacky packs, if many of you remember those. So, action figures, vehicles, particularly GI Joe, as we all know, originated as a vehicle concept more than an action figure concept, was a natural progression for me. But working on some of those iconic brands throughout Hasbro, which I'm sure we'll touch on, was really a dream come true. But looking back, it's really been I was really a car guy, that made transitions into other types of toys as the years progressed.
So seeing, I'm a collector, of course, of what you built. Do you collect cars or anything like that, or do you have any hobbies like that collector mentality, or no?
I have some of my old, Matchbox and Hot Wheels cars from, my childhood. Certainly Tonka, which is something I was fortunate enough to work on the brand. I have some of my original Tonka trucks, as well as some GI Joe products as well. Going back, into the early years of GI Joe for the 12-inch, right, from the 60s and 70s. Um,
Mhm.
but from a collector standpoint, not so much into collector as much nowadays. I had some hobbies here and there, but as far as just what I worked on, Hasbro really from a collector standpoint, and what I had as a child, with the Matchbox and Hot Wheels and Tonka.
Are you still doing bikes or no? 'Cause I know you're doing some of that stuff.
Yeah, I kind of dabbled in some classic bikes, from the 50s and 60s, bicycles, that is, for
Yeah.
those we call bikes. Um, but yeah, I was doing a little bit of those. Kind of have a collection that's outgrown my space. Probably now around 40 bicycles,
Wow.
that I refurbished basically. Have not sold that many. I bought a lot, but haven't sold a lot. So it's overtaking some of my space. But yeah, that was giving me some pleasure in going through some of those old bikes and refurbishing them, keeping them as pristine as I could from an originality standpoint, not painting them, not doing
Mhm.
anything, keeping the original patina, but really bringing them to life, as true iconic products as they were.
So if anybody's looking for a bicycle, get with
Yeah,
Bob.
well,
Give him a call.
yeah.
Um, you mentioned working on different brands. Can you list off some of the different brands you worked on at Hasbro? And we'll get into the Hasbro later, but just some of those brands that you worked on while you're there.
Sure. So some of the iconic toy brands, GI Joe, of course, WWF, or those of you know WWE, Tonka, Mr. Potato Head, had a stint with Play School and some of the infant toys, Air Raiders, those of you who remember that, short-lived brand. And I worked in market research when I started at Hasbro, which I know we'll get into that, but that
Mhm.
allowed me the exposure to see a lot of different products, not just in boys toys, but also in girls toys and in Play School. But those are some of the key iconic brands that I've worked on throughout my tenure at Hasbro.
And what years did you work at Hasbro? I forgot to ask that earlier.
Yeah, I started Hasbro in 1985, and I went through to 1999.
Okay.
And so, it's been a good 14-year run.
Did you work on Cops and Crooks or no?
I did not. I mean, I was in
Okay.
boys' toys, and a colleague of mine did Cops and Crooks. But
Okay.
we're a close knit group, so there was a lot of cross pollination of ideas, particularly over lunches that we've had and things where others were working on Cowboys of Moo Mesa or Cops and Crooks or Visionaries or some of the other brands that I didn't work on, Transfomers, but there was a lot of cross pollination of ideas and thoughts and things, as we were in boys toys, as a group.
Awesome. Um, you know, what type of positions did you hold prior to working in the toy industry? Did they help you prepare for working in the industry itself?
Yeah, actually, interesting. My first job was in retail, at a regional. I'll tell you a quick story. A regional retail chain, in Rhode Island. And what's noted about it? Well, the name of it was Ann and Hope Department Stores. For those who are either from the Northeast or may have heard of that, they're out of business now. But what's interesting is Sam Walton of Walmart, back in the 1962, I believe, came and visited an Ann and Hope store in Rhode Island to take a page out of his retail book, basically, and seeing how a regional retailer could do so well. And he heard a little bit about Ann and Hope and what was going on in that part of the country. So it was interesting that he took a note and came out and visited the chain. But I did start at Ann and Hope, worked in retail, really seeing how retail worked from both a pricing, inventory, stocking, customer interaction standpoint. It was a great platform that I consider that really started my business career off, is really at retail.
Awesome. And what was their position there? Was it?
It was just sales, a sales clerk. I'd like to tell you I worked in toys, but I worked in domestics.
Okay.
I worked in curtains, curtain rods, and rugs, and towels, and those types of things. Domestic goods.
It's all right. The foundation is important, right? So,
exactly.
Some of the best marketing ideas are born out of an individual's ability to challenge others' way of thinking. Tell me about a time when you were successful in doing this.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, as a marketer, you're really trying to look at, a product, and look at, even not sometimes a product, even just looking at new ideas and coming up with solutions for problems, or solutions for something that you think would meet the needs of a consumer. And you keep your eye on the target audience that's involved. You're looking to attract either new audiences or bring in, make something fresh and new of existing audiences. Now, I remember working specifically in market research at Hasbro and conducting primary and secondary research, focus groups among boys 6 to 12, talking to them about how they play, how they imagine playing with figures and playing with vehicles, and specifically G.I. Joe, leading to development of, for instance, like air gliders and sonic backpacks, which was, the start of really electronics in some of the toys back then. So, taking an idea that the kid might, take a plane and go, or a car, and roll it around and make the sound, led us to the development of providing a button to push for electronic sounds to be made to enhance that play. And so I use that as a good example, Dan, because I think, as I said earlier, research really gave me that platform, I think, to really well-round my focus in marketing. But it allowed me some insight into the thinking around the audience that we were conducting these focus groups with, and how would they play, and what things would do, and how, if it did make noise, how could you make that vehicle or that figure come to life? And I think those are the types of things that I think about my background, and really feel as though that really helped me to be a better marketer.
Yeah, I think having that market research position, I'm sure, just gave you so much insight into different aspects of the toy industry itself, and some of those focus groups, because a lot of that was done in person back then, right? So
Correct.
So no, that's and like you said, I'm sure we'll touch upon some of those electronics momentarily when we talk about G.I. Joe, because that was the time when you were on the brand, when started introducing a lot of that. So throughout Hasbro, but also throughout your entire life, what have you found to be some of the biggest hurdles and significant differences when moving between different types of roles in your career?
Yeah, so I guess my marketing sales career kind of spans 37 plus years. First part of that, as I like to say, was the fun stuff with toys, with Hasbro, and then made transition into the high tech world with electronics, and worked for Motorola. Launched the first Razor phone, for those of you who knew the Razor phone, and several other technology companies. And I think when I look back, the biggest challenges throughout all of that, even at Hasbro, was the technology changes and keeping up with the attention of the audience, keeping
Mm-hmm.
attention with the new target market. You see things about Hasbro throughout their years where they got into more licensing, and we don't have to go down that road on what was good or the bad. But I think overall it's just technology. And if you look at yourself for your audience, Dan, thinking about, wow, look how technology has changed for me personally in my life. Even a car, for when you first started to drive to you drive today. Um, whether or not you're 60 years old or you're 20 years old, I mean, technology just continues to change. So that's
Mm-hmm.
been my biggest challenge is the technology changes when it comes to sales and marketing, from both a consumer standpoint as well as from a professional standpoint, in doing my job.
Oh yeah, I mean, most definitely. I mean, talking to some people, when I was talking to Andy Perlmutter about the laying out of the books and stuff, he's like, if you had to do this back in the day, he's like, it would have been so much harder with comps and everything else. He's like, you have it made with being able to do the books digitally.
And
And
you look at engineering and the model shop,
yeah.
the rapid prototyping. That stuff never existed, right? That was all handmade prototypes back then. But
Hmm.
now with rapid prototypes, and it's like it's changed the way you bring products to market in a big way.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges I think in today, to be in the toy industry today. I think one of the biggest challenges is your competition against technology. The air, iPads or iPhones or electronics themselves like that. I mean, at a certain age, I mean, at young kids, I think preschool age, I think parents are still, for the most part, getting them a lot of those toys. But as they age out of that, I think it's becoming harder and harder. I mean, I know my kids being fairly young, I try to keep them as kids as long as possible, right, with toys. But even as a toy collector and author and all that of toys, even there it's a challenge, even though it's in their face probably more often than the normal person.
And
So
right, and they get bored easily. I mean, kids just generally get bored easy. So I think you got to keep things fresh. You got to keep things new, and technology is one way to do that.
mhm, mhm. What things did you take away from Hasbro and incorporate in your future positions?
Yeah, interesting. So Hasbro, so you all know and your audience knows, has been a part of my life very early on and for a long period of time. Even before I worked at Hasbro, my dad worked at Hasbro in the model shop in the early '70s, and I remember going in on Saturdays when he was pulling some prototypes out of molds to get them ready for Toy Fair. I would go in with my dad, when I was just 10, 11 years old. So for me, Hasbro's been a big part of my life early on and throughout my career. And I always look back at the time spent at Hasbro. And really, what I think about, and you probably heard this from a lot of my colleagues during my time, is really the people that I felt made the difference. There are numerous examples of things and people that have really influenced my life, going back to those Hasbro days. And that's really kind of helped me prepare, if you will, for the second part of my career, as I mentioned, being with high tech and
Mhm.
transitioning more into sales. Is some of those early experiences and those people that are still around today that you're friends with, that you'll have on some of these podcasts as well, that have really, I think, shaped me as a person, as a marketer, and as a sales and marketing executive, both in the toy industry as well as outside the toy industry.
And yeah, and I mean, yeah, a lot of those hopefully we'll have on, and you know, um, is a unique time from what I've gathered, and doing the mini reunions and all that fun stuff. It's like you see this dynamic, and I don't know if you see that today in some companies. So
Yeah.
it's like going down memory lane for many of you, and sometimes I have to rethink, like, I had to kind of step back myself, like, oh yeah, you guys weren't all like, hey, let's all hang out, back then, and bringing you together. Sometimes people don't know each other, or it's been many years since you guys have seen each other, so the relationships aren't there. But I have heard, some people have reconnected though, and have been able to reconnect and build upon the relationships that they had in the past. So that's always kind of rewarding from my standpoint. Like, if I had any little inkling part of that, I'm happy about that.
Well,
Um,
and this isn't really so much a plug, Dan, but and you've heard me say this. It's credit to you, credit to a lot of the collectors out there that have brought us together because of their interest in GI Joe, because of the history of GI Joe. That's really brought some of us together in some of the conventions that we've attended. Obviously, you do a great job in the books that you have out, and you pulling and interviewing hundreds of former Hasbro folks on development of the toys. I mean, it really does joggle my memory on a lot of the things that I kind of stashed away and either forgot about or just just didn't remember.
mhm.
But really, it's the credit of you and some of the collectors and folks that you have watching your podcast that have really helped, I think, bring some of that stuff out, at least for me. That's been very rewarding as far as I'm concerned.
I appreciate that. And, you know, and, you know, I think what year did we meet? 2017, 16. So I mean, it's crazy how long it's been, right?
I know.
When you think
Yeah.
about it, and you've always been welcoming into your home and, hanging out and going to dinners and stuff. And, we'll touch upon Kathy in a moment and that, where that got started. I wonder what company.
Yeah.
But you mentioned your dad, working in the model shop. Can you talk a little bit about what his role was at Hasbro and, you know, how he inspired you maybe to not follow in his footsteps as far as the model shop and stuff, but more just working for Hasbro itself?
Yeah. No, my dad was a master pattern maker. So for those of you who know that trade, it's really, you talk about not having electronics, right? So that was reading blueprints and taking and sculpting or uh, developing a pattern out of wood, carving it out of wood from actual blueprints to be used as the first mold to be developed. So they would use those patterns that my dad would make from the blueprints, and then develop molds to produce production of the toys. And so his role had to do with developing those patterns, but then also developing a lot of the models. And as a kid, right? I mean, again, you're talking 60s, mid 60s, late 60s, early 70s. I did have every 12-inch and multiple accessories of every 12-inch GI Joe out there. That was developed, and some things that weren't even developed.
Hmm.
So it was fascinating for me as a child, but then also my dad being that part of my childhood, and having that ability to do something like that, to carve. It's really a craft
Oh
to
yeah, I
carve
mean,
something like that out of wood.
it's amazing. Like when I talked to someone about the whole pattern process, I was just amazed, and I'm like, wow, like to be able to do that out of wood. I mean, it's one thing to do, clay or different type of textures or materials, but to do something out of wood, I mean, it's not. Once you make, if you make that cut, you made
Right.
that cut. So you either got to fix it, or I mean, I know there's times where they maybe glue stuff back on or something, but to get that much detail for the tooling, I mean, it's crazy to me. It's
Yeah.
crazy to me. And so, I mean, your dad truly was an artist in that sense, and an engineer. I mean, in a way, that combination of both. And I know, like when we did HasCon and we went to the model shop, I know that was a special experience for you. Seeing kind of going down memory lane. So I'm glad I was part of that and witness to that because it just showed how much your dad meant to you. So thank you
Yeah,
for sharing.
by the way, it was great. It was emotional because touring that building, and going down that aisle where my dad's desk was, and that was done just after they renovated that building, the 1027 Newport Avenue building. And so seeing that and knowing my dad spent hours, years, in that particular area, it was emotional a little bit for me. So it was special, and so I did appreciate going in there and having that tour.
And I'm glad you were able to. to be able to experience that. Like I teased a little bit, there's special connections. You had your dad at Hasbro, but talk to me a little bit about how you met your wife, Kathy, and the connection there with Hasbro.
Yeah. So my wife, Kathy, worked in the chem lab at Hasbro. So she graduated from SMU out of Massachusetts in a chemistry degree. And her job was working on My Little Pony perm solution and the flame and paint retardant, testing that would go on. So any product, from the safety testing, flammability testing, anything to do with chemicals, she worked with the chem lab. Fast forward to the day she resigned and was leaving to go work for a big boy chemical or pharmaceutical company. She left, and one of the friends of hers said, "Oh, would you like to go to a child test?" She said, "What's a child test?" Well, the market research group does these child tests where they look at GI Joe aged children, 6 to 12-year-old boys. We look behind a one-way glass and see how they can put together instruction sheets and make any modifications for the copywriters or what have you. And she says, "Yeah, well, that sounds good. It's not too far. It's just down the street." So she accompanied this colleague to child test, and lo and behold, I was running the child test, and that's where we met. And it was her last day. So I met her on her last day at Hasbro.
Way out.
And then we stayed in touch after that. But she moved away and worked for another company, and we got married years later. So the rest is history.
Such a great story. I know that story, but I think it's such a great story. Like timing. I mean, it's all about timing. I mean,
exactly.
And that friend that did that. So, I'm assuming, I don't know if you guys are still friends with her, but pretty amazing that just that one chance, meeting. So, well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Let's see. Sorry, I'm getting to my next page of questions. So now we're going to jump a little bit into more Hasbro specific. You talked a little bit about your dad working there and, his part and how you kind of were there as a kid. And I mean, I didn't have the same experience as far as the toy industry, but, I remember going to my dad's shop and he prints t-shirts and stuff, and being at that age and getting on the computers right when computers were just starting out, but screen printing and learning the job and working with him, as well. So I kind of have that similar type of bond, working with your dad, in that same type of realm. But, explain to me, when you started at Hasbro, what made you decide to go down that path with Hasbro itself?
Yeah. So I graduated 1985. Actually, I was an intern at Hasbro, one of the second college interns that they ever hired. And my major was marketing. So I was business major, marketing. And so thought retail, because of my retail experience, was where I wanted to kind of land. And my dad inquired actually at Hasbro about an internship, and I was hired and in market research. And so they hired me full time after I graduated. But I started as an intern, a college intern, actually. And so that's kind of where my dad helped, kind of open the door to that and expose. And that allowed me to exposure to the marketing group. I mean, from market research to product marketing to all of the marketing functions, licensing, that really opened the door. And that's where I kind of landed my first, major job out of school, was at Hasbro, from an intern to starting out as a market research analyst, and then progressed from there into product marketing and product management, senior product management. Worked for and worked with many of the classic colleagues that everyone probably that tunes in here knows. Kirk Bazigian, Bob Prupis was the one that brought me over to Boys Toys from market research. And then, all of the sales teams that I worked with throughout the years as well, from marketing. But as many of you know, marketing really was the lead role throughout Hasbro. marketing interfaced with every single department at Hasbro, from not only designers through all the product development process, engineering, model shop, copywriting, packaging, testing, market research, sales. There's many, many more. So that really, I think, rounded my background to be who I am today, because it really afforded me the opportunity to really touch every single aspect of a development of a toy, of a product, not just a toy, but a product. And every classic marketing company out there, Procter and Gamble, they all function the same way from a product management standpoint. So that really, I think, is really what kind of really brought my career full circle, and really, I think, had me develop into who I am as a marketing and salesperson.
Now, where did you graduate?
I graduated from Bryant University. Again, it's
Okay.
a business school in Rhode Island.
I think I've driven by it when I was up there.
Yeah, they're northwestern portion of the state. But good business school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, like you said, you worked with Kirk and Bob and a lot of other marketing, professionals. And, it's always fun to hear kind of all the different stories that you guys, inside of work and outside of work, of course, and what made it a fun environment, and all the new ideas that you guys had to create. So, I mentioned, you mentioned earlier a couple different positions that you've held. You talked a lot about the market research analyst. Can you talk a little bit about what your responsibilities were as a product manager, specifically on G.I. Joe? Like, what did that job entail? I know sometimes, well, not at times, I'm sure, like you said, you're responsible kind of for the success of the product itself. So it really fell on you if it failed, essentially, is what I've learned over the years. So can you talk a little bit about your responsibilities in that role over G.I. Joe?
Yeah. So as a product manager, as I mentioned, you're responsible for every aspect of that product: success, failure, development. So working closely early on with Greg Bernston and his team on GI Joe. Greg obviously was the design director. Wayne Luther, Steve DeGuano, the team that developed the concepts, and looking at the product line, and really kind of looking at not only what products would we introduce, how we would price the product, what the line would look like for the upcoming season, really taking that all in and putting that together into a marketing plan for presentation to senior management. Once that got approved through line reviews, and I'm sure you've covered some of those things in your other previous podcasts and other collateral that you've sent out. But line reviews were quite interesting and memorable, from reviewing every single product and product line with Stephen Hasenfeld, that then was Alan Hasenfeld, all the way down the chain of command. Those were interesting times, and they were fun times, and they were trying times, and a lot of products made it through, and a lot of products didn't make it through. But ultimately, the products that did and didn't were the responsibility of the product manager, working with designers and working with the team. Once we did get approval, then it was then fine-tuning the development of that, developing the packaging, developing copy. If it was a new product, legal with name clearances and copyright clearances, design aspects of the toy, costing, making sure that it hits certain price points, and then introducing it to sales, getting sales on board, introducing that to sales so they can get their buyers of Toys R Us or Walmart or Target or whatever retail account kind of on board. And so all the way along the steps that the product would go through, and it would be multiple, from beginning of concept all the way through to on the shelf, was the responsibility, really ultimate responsibility of the product manager. And they had to sign off. We had to sign off on every single step along the way, and every product. As you've seen those little green cards that probably a lot of products that are out there for sale have been attached to, those were standards that were signed off when the product was released to production. And they would have a signature by marketing, by legal, by design, by engineering, and I'm probably missing another one where they would be signed off, and those standards would be held for that product, so that it would be adhered to in production. So really, a product manager encompassed every single aspect of a product development from beginning to end, and that's really the best way to think about product management.
Yeah. And that was probably the biggest challenge, in doing the books, because, I started out, to create, with Kirk kind of talking about the original G.I. Joe. And then I led into, the figure design, then the vehicle design. And I'm like, I knew marketing's in there the whole time, but I'm like, okay, how do I incorporate this in? And
Right.
so, I had to write it like, okay, marketing's been here the whole time. It's just these other processes were going on at the same time. So try to really mold it all together it was a challenge, to get it getting written that way. But hopefully I captured it for people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you
Um,
did a great job of capturing that.
you talked about line reviews. Any funny, memorable line reviews that you can share? And it can be from any product. It doesn't have to be specifically GI Joe, but any that
Uh,
stick out to you.
I try to think. There's memorable ones and multiple ones. Some of them I choose not to repeat. But I think what I think was challenging, and when I think of a leader, and many of you have probably, your audience has heard about Stephen Hasenfeld and how he led Hasbro to the company it is today. And you know, hope, wish he was still around or would have been around to see more of that development. Unfortunately, he passed away earlier on, but his leadership, he really, those line reviews, he would call on people from the back of the room, the front of the room. It wouldn't doesn't matter if you were in a leadership role or if you were a copywriter. If he saw you, he'd call you and he'd say, "Okay, Bob, out of the 16 GI Joe figures that Greg has shown now for next year's lineup, tell me the weakest two and your favorite two and why." And you know, it was it was, you
No
think about
pressure.
it, it was challenging, right, to do
Yeah.
that because you didn't want to throw anybody under the bus. You didn't want
Mhm.
to throw a potential great concept under the bus, but he would take your input and he would use your input and he would call on you for specific things like that. And it was interesting, those line reviews, and there was a lot of times where it got heated, but it also was kind of a tenuous atmosphere because again, you didn't want to take a product, and it could have been a figure, it could have been a vehicle. You knew where he stood on certain concepts, and if he didn't like something, he would make it known that he didn't like it, and
Mhm.
it would get quickly shuffled off to the next for the next concept to be shown. So I would just say that probably out of all of them, probably wasn't the most memorable, but that was probably the most indelible in my mind on how senior leaders really took an active role in concepts and in product development.
And I think it's important, they're listening to all the voices, right? And I think that's what I've heard about Steven. I mean, he knew people's names, and I
Mhm.
know Hasbro wasn't as large as a company as it became, or has been. But I've heard great things about Steven and his leadership, and it would have been interesting to see, what would have happened in the years to come,
Yeah,
following his leader, following his passing.
yeah.
Um, Now, when you started at Hasbro, did you start working on GI Joe immediately? Well, I know you worked in the marketing research, but as far as brands and becoming a product manager, was GI Joe your first brand that you were in charge of, or what brand were you in charge of initially?
No, actually, coming after market research, coming over to Boys Toys, the Bob Prupis pulled me over. My first concept I worked on, or first brand I worked on, was aerators.
Oh, okay.
Um, and that was interesting, right? Because it's a new concept, homegrown concept. Figures and vehicles, but again, more vehicle based than figure based, since the figures were bet you inch and a quarter tall with very limited articulation. So it was all about the air powered vehicles, and the concept behind that, and the storyline, and developing the commercials, and developing potentially what the series would be, and some of the programming would be to really establish that as a potential brand. Because GI Joe was the homegrown Hasbro brand, but then Hasbro obviously continued to expand into other concepts, beyond just GI Joe, as would only be just a one-trick pony when it came to boys' toys. So Air Raiders was my first, and that was relatively short-lived, probably maybe a year, and then started in GI Joe as a product manager right shortly after Air Raiders.
Yeah, I know Ron did some of the figures for Air Raiders. I don't know who did any of the vehicles though. I never really have run across anybody who.
Dan Price, who also worked on WWF figures, I think
Okay.
did quite a bit of Air Raiders, if I
Okay.
recall.
I just never ran across anybody talking about it, so I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah,
Um, you were being in marketing, and you and I have talked a lot about the commercials, and you shared some of your imagery even for the books from commercial shoots and stuff like that. What's your fondest memory working on the GI Joe commercials, and is there any funny incidents that you can share about?
yeah. So commercials at that time were all done overseas, and for those of you who may or may not be aware, the reason for that is if you shoot a commercial in the States, this might have changed, but you have to go under Screen Actors Guild, SAG. You have rules, unions. So the cost factor was a big, and you had residual, talent residual. So every time that commercial aired, if you were using a U.S. Actor, kid or adult, you had residuals that had to be paid. So in commercials where we would air those multiple times, it would get costly. So most of our commercials were all done overseas in foreign countries, particularly Holland. So one of my fondest memories is going over to Amsterdam, and shooting GI Joe shuttle commercial, as well as Sky Patrol in Amsterdam. And the shuttle was just the basic shuttle part of the commercial, which I've given
Crusader.
you some Polaroids, and then the Sky Patrol was my line of GI Joe, and I, remember those mylar parachutes, trying to get those to actually fly and open up to look like real parachutes and don't look fake. So they catch those, and then because one of the not so funny aspects was in the hot lamps and lights, the mylar would catch fire. So we worry about the mylar material catching fire, as those parachutes were being used for the commercials. And then it was always a challenge because we were in another country, finding English speaking kids that did have a role at speaking, some speaking on the commercials, where they would say, Tiger Force attack, or, Sky Patrol, or whatever the lines may be. So a lot of those countries that we did finally shoot in where a lot of U.S. military bases were also housed. So you'd have a lot of U.S. military families with English-speaking children. So that was kind of an interesting piece of it, and it was just a great experience going on commercial shoots. We shot a lot in Vancouver, British Columbia, which was an easier trip because of the distance, and versus Holland or Italy or Germany. I think there was one. I can't remember some of the other countries that we shot in, but some of those were great memories, great experience, and things that we had, challenges that we had to overcome and work on, but were tremendous experiences.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I should have assumed, but I always just heard about Vancouver, so that's the only stories I've ever really heard. So it's interesting to hear some of those different ones. And you guys really like fires on your commercial shoots. I mean, you got the battle wagon with Kirk, this or the Mylar. But no, I mean, it had to be, and I know we'll touch upon it maybe another time, some of those WWF commercials, because I want to hear a lot about those commercials when we have you back on for an episode, really talking about that experience.
Sure.
When it came to the GI Joe promotions, where did a lot of those ideas come from? Like where, you had, like, so I'm trying to think of the ones that you would have worked on. You were during was it the rings,
Rings, there were tattoos.
tattoos, Trying to think some of the different ones from that
Face
era.
paint. We did face
Yeah.
paint.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The face paint one. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yep. So a lot of those came from outside agencies
Hmm.
that were premium agencies. Premium meaning, like face paint. You get the little tube of face paint on the blister pack with the figure or the tattoo. It was
Hmm.
a way to extend collectability among a product line, such as the figures, and it was to give some new life into those products as well. Um, micro figures was another one
Hmm.
that I worked on. GI Joe micro figures. Some of those, the mail away stuff, was different, where you save up the flag points and mail those in, and some were the on pack type of promotions. And again, it was all cost based uh, products ideas. So you had to work in a pretty tight, thin margin on what the cost would be. But it was a way to give an extra play value, some enhanced value to the product by adding that dimension, that premium or that promotion to the product line. Not just for GI Joe, but for other brands as well. But GI Joe was the big one because it was had the lasting and staying power. So it needed a lot of refreshing, if you will, beyond
Yeah.
just product to sustain it and to keep it going.
The perceived value is important. Yeah.
Right.
Collectors thank you now today, the variant collectors who have to get that figure with every different promotion. So thank you to you for that. Um,
Yeah.
um, you know, Tell me about the most challenging project that you were involved in when you're working at Hasbro with GI Joe. Was there one that sticks out to you as far as a challenge?
Um, they all had their challenges. You mentioned the battle wagon a
Hmm.
minute or so ago. I remember, trying to get the model shop to get that Gatling gun to work
Hmm.
consistently for line reviews was a huge challenge. I remember having fights, literally having fights with some of the folks in the model shop. That was a very, very, I would say, complex mechanism to build by
Hmm.
hand and to have it reliable. So that was pretty challenging. But I'd say, overall in GI Joe, as the years went on, and some of your audience may or may not agree, right? There are several versions of GI Joe variations, different. There was Sky Patrol and Python Patrol that I worked on, and um,
Night
uh,
Force.
Night
Yeah.
Force, and there continued to be challenges on ways to keep the brand new, creative, fresh, and not over creating too of a new much of a new segment or area of development. Uh, GI Joe expanded into so many different areas with Slaughters Marauders, and there were
Hmm.
various different, call it cousins, if you will, offshoots of GI Joe that it was challenging, year in year out to keep it fresh, keep it going, and keep it relevant, so that kids, as they came into the brand at say this at the lower ages of 6, and to keep them through that higher end 10, and it even became more challenging as they became 11 and 12 years old. They were into so many other things that what they were in at 6 years old is not what your child's going to be in when they're 10 years old. I mean, 4 years is a long time, in
Hmm.
a child's life. And so keeping the brand fresh and keeping it new and innovative and creative was probably the biggest challenge overall. I would say from a marketing and sales perspective.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of those subgroups, save money, right, on tooling and stuff. But at that time, I'm not sure what year Nintendo came out, but did you start feeling like you're talking about young kids and the challenges did you start feeling that impact even back then with video games starting to take the focus away from the toys and
Oh yeah, yeah. Like I said earlier in this interview, electronics became a big game changer, right?
Mhm.
And so just the lights and sounds on things, and sonic backpacks, and and Tonka with vehicles and stuff, and having those come to life. Um, we'll get to WWF at another point where we did, the talking wrestlers. I mean, there were a lot of things that I think electronics just changed the dynamics of development and brought a new dimension of playing and imagining with toys for children at that age. And so I think, yes, electronics definitely became a big factor. And, you got into some of the competitor products that were, what is it, Sonic Shot or Survivor Shot, and there's guns that did a lot of things. So there was a lot of toys that became more exciting to children than the conventional play that we at Hasbro had, for years developed with action figures and vehicles, and some of that conventionary play that, was tough to be up against some of the electronics that, that definitely changed the game for toy development.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, the different collector genres, because with us, people get stuff graded, or you have it in a nice case and it's your toy. But as recently, there's an auction going on with like graded video games, and like at least a toy, like I'm like I can like look at that. I guess if you look at a video game, inside of a case, maybe memories come back. I don't know. It's interesting to see the different things, but it's like a baseball card. I guess same thing. How did do you remember when you got that baseball card? Did you put in your spokes as a kid, and you shouldn't have,
Right.
whatever the case may be. So,
Right.
um,
Or wrote on them, which now are collectibles, and if you write on them, they're not worth as much, right? Yeah.
um, let's see. So, in your opinion, how important was it to have a diverse group of people working on the brand, and who thought differently and could express their opinions and ideas, openly and freely, like you were mentioning, even during the line reviews?
Yeah. So I think, having that diverse background and group of people touching the product and interfacing with each one of them, because of marketing's role and product management lead, really, I think was a great way of getting some appreciation for everyone's point of view, and each department, would touch the product, and but marketing's job was to keep the eye on the end goal, right? So at the end of the day, if it wasn't in cost, or if it was, had too many spray ops on a particular figure because it blew the cost, it was marketing's job to decide, along with the other, with designers and others, which ones to keep, which ones to not keep. Again, keeping the eye on the end goal, keeping a schedule. So the appreciation of everyone's input was extremely valuable. I mean, I'm not the most creative person in the world, and we touched on that earlier, but my hat's off to the design folks, right? So Ron Rudat and Greg Burnson and, Dave Kunitz and Frank Coronis, and there's a number of Guy Cassaday, number of folks that you've heard the names out there that are true, inspirational design, talented designers. So, that from to an indie promoter and folks in packaging, I mean, there's creativity in that, and keeping, them engaged, and keeping a close ear on what their inputs are. That all was part of the process, and I think just it afforded me the opportunity to appreciate everyone's point of view all the way through the production stage.
And it just kind of builds upon the whole team aspect. You had to work as a team.
Correct. Yep.
Um, you mentioned spray ops. I'm always curious. Was there like a general rule of thumb as far as how many spray ops? Because I'll see the figure sculpt sheets, and I have a general idea, like you know how many were, as time went on. Not the early series, of course, but as time went on, it seemed always like in that 20 range. Was there like hey, we can only have this many spray ops per se, or did you like move it from, oh, hey, no, we're going to take red off that guy because we want to add blue to this guy, so we're going to remove that one from him, and that way allows him to have blue? Did you ever do that, like from figure to figure, or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, so there wasn't an average number. I don't recall exactly what they were, but there was an average number that was costed into each figure, and then because of the design of the figure, if it was Cobra, if it was a GI Joe, you know, you might have a tattoo on his arm that's a spray up. So I mean, there were different times where certain figures would be more expensive because of spray ups than others. And again,
Mhm.
that might have an impact into who we put in an assortment. So it all balances out from a cost perspective. But yeah, there was an average number of spray ups. There were a lot of guys or some guy figures that were higher than others, and some that were lower, and then it all had to kind of balance out. Again, trying to keep true to what the identity of the figure was, but not to diminish it to the point where it was unrecognizable. Um, but
Mhm.
but it was that's all part of that was all part of the process.
Now, did you? I'm trying to remember spring-loaded weapons and stuff like that. Was that you, or is that after for GI Joe specifically?
There was some spring-loaded backpacks, if I recall.
Okay.
Motorized backpacks.
Okay. Motorized. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Motorized
Yeah.
back.
Yep. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
So you
Wind
worked
up.
on those.
Yeah, and that was an idea coming from Tomy, right? If you
Okay.
recall, Tomy did a lot of wind up toys at the time. So I don't know where the concept was came from, internal or not, but those motorized backpacks came or stemmed from, you know, motorized devices or products from Tomy, which then
Gotcha.
was introduced into GI Joe, and that's how a lot of the GI Joe concepts, you know, came about. I mean, Greg Bernston and I one year, and I don't recall what year it was, we went to a an arms convention in Washington D.C. where the military was selling, you know, real like launch, uh, launch devices and armored vehicles for military, for real life military, and a lot of the ideas came from those types of things. And I know your audience has talked about the Warthog and some of those original GI Joe vehicles. They were based on real life military vehicles, and so a lot
Mhm.
of that came from concepts that were true to life that were then utilized to be a thought or an idea for a particular vehicle or a figure or an idea for a concept.
Which has always been interesting with GI Joe's bringing that aspect, the real military, but also the fictional, and then of course you have Prupus Air, involved in all that as well.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean that's what I think makes GI Joe so unique. And some of the vehicles, there's even a lot of detail underneath the vehicle that wouldn't typically, a company maybe not spend money on. Like, well, who cares? The kid's not gonna, it'll roll it over maybe, but nobody's gonna be paying attention. But you guys actually you know, made it a point on some vehicles to appreciate that detail. And
Yep.
I know as time went on, it maybe became less and less, but early on, I know that was something important.
Yep. Make
And
it real. Make it real, and the more detailed. And I'm sure Kirk has talked about the articulation. Like at one
yeah,
point, GI Joe had the most articulation in a 3 3/4 inch figure on the market, right?
hmm
And so articulation was big, making that more come to life, making that figure more real because of the articulation. And that was the rang true in your comment about detail on the bottom of vehicles too, like making that vehicle look more real, not just like a hard hunk of plastic, that it looks more like a real product would
almost
be.
like a model kit.
Yeah.
Almost like a model kit.
Right.
Um, kind of skip a little bit, but you talk about real. We have there's a character that was based on a real person, yourself, Major Storm. So talk to me a little bit about that process of having a character based on you. How does it make you feel having a character based on you? I mean, that's kind of a really cool concept to have something based on you, and especially if you want to talk about the artwork, for I mean, package artwork. I mean, that Doug Hart had done. Can you talk a little bit about the whole how that came to be and the whole process and what it feels like to be, um, you know, I guess preserved in plastic form as well.
A real life superhero, as I like to
Yes.
say. Yeah. So I mean, it's truly been an honor to work on a lot of the great brands, including GI Joe, right? That I've worked on at Hasbro. But I think working on GI Joe, and iconic brand as it is, in development there, I wanted to be a figure. I wanted to be a figure. A lot of my colleagues are the open stock figures that are sold in the assortments. The General, as we all know, was one of the biggest GI Joe vehicles developed after the aircraft carrier and then the shuttle. And so in that development and being a vehicle guy myself, I decided that I think I should be the driver of the General. So that was sort of, my task and my goal. And as the figure then became developed, Kirk Rowan, who is a very talented designer, was the one that designed my figure. Took a picture of my face, profile, side, face, and head, and then sent it off to a sculptor, and they sculpted my face on the head of Major Storm, who then became the driver of the General. Doug Hart was the illustrator and artist that drew my figure for the box art. And I have the original of that, as well as my figure of Major Storm as well, and then the bio cards that come along with each of the driver figures was approved by marketing by me, and that was by copywriting. Copywriting would write the bios, and then we'd put my name, birth date, or birthplace, I guess it was, not date but birthplace, on the bio card. So as that product was being developed, which I loved that product. I think it was a lot of play value. It was, a platform type vehicle with multiple vehicles. It had the Locust helicopter that came included with it. I thought it was just a great all around G.I. Joe vehicle at a scale that demanded, a major being the driver. So yeah, I kind of look at that as one of the things in my lifetime that I'm always super proud of, and it's a great talking point at cocktail events and things to say, yeah, you're talking to Bob Swanson, who is a real life superhero and became Major Storm, and G.I. Joe Major Storm, the driver of the General.
Exactly. And then, like you said, it's a huge vehicle. I mean, Guy Cassidy describes the original concept. He's like, yeah, it wouldn't fit in, between a door, jam, essentially. So he had to shrink it a little bit, but yeah, that artwork, that, the package art resembles you so much, it's amazing. And I'll show that within the podcast, throw an image up, but it's amazing to see the resemblance and how well he caught you as far as your look and everything else. So pretty cool idea and concept. And like you said, it's unique because you do come with a vehicle. It's not just some small little low price point $4.99 vehicle either. It's the giant one for that year. So it's pretty neat to have that to have that behind you. When working on figures of vehicles, there are several that wouldn't be taking a final product. Can you discuss anything that never worked out and maybe why, as far as maybe specifically G.I. Joe, particular character, particular vehicle, or maybe even a subgroup that you remember, like you guys pitched and just didn't get off the ground? Maybe either Steven or Alan didn't like it, or whatever the case was.
I knew you were going to stump me one of these times on some of these questions, but my memory
you don't.
Good. I know my memory isn't quite as good as it used to be, but I'm trying to think.
Go look at volumes 14, 15. Maybe something will come back in the future, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Some concepts in there, because I know that's a very hot topic for a lot of the collectors, right? Is whatever happened to this, or how come this didn't make it, or why did this didn't work out? And there's been few. I can't remember exactly one right now that I can.
We'll save it for.
I'll save that.
We'll save it for Dallas.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, Bob's a guest at the DFW show that I'll be emceeing in June of 2025. I don't have the dates in front of me, but I'll put them up here. But be sure to come by and meet Major Storm. I don't know if you want to bring your generals, but bring your file cards at least. And,
Right.
I'm sure he'll be more than happy to sign it for you. And, maybe a figure as well. Maybe we'll figure out a way to sign that. But
yeah, looking forward to meeting many of you. So,
couple few last questions here. You know, for you, what separates GI Joe from all other toy lines that you've worked on?
Yeah, I think, for GI Joe, it's really been the iconic nature of the brand. Everyone knows GI Joe. I don't care how old or how young. You've heard of GI Joe. You may have not played with GI Joe, but you've heard of GI Joe. So it's been one of those iconic brands that have just withstood the test of time. And I think it's withstood the test of time not only because of the great, you know, nature of the brand and the products that were developed and the time that many of myself and colleagues worked on the brand, but it's really the collector community and that strong collector community that's kept the brand alive and kept it out in front. And so I really think that that has been the one thing in my mind that's withstood the test of time is not just how great a brand was when you were a kid or when I was a kid. It's really been how well the collector community has really kept that brand going and
Mm-hmm.
sustained.
Mm-hmm.
And that I feel proud to have worked on the brand and proud to be associated with the people I worked with and proud to be associated with a brand, GI Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with you more. I mean, the community itself is special. Yeah, I think, unfortunately, like we talked about, technology and everything else, it's getting harder and harder. And, I don't know if you've seen a lot of the new classified line, the 6-inch line for GI Joe. So, I mean, it's more catered towards collectors, of course. But I know some kids are getting into it as well. And, the hope is that it continues on and lives on. And, I mean, I don't know about you, but probably when you were, right out of college and working on GI Joe or even a Hasbro, I don't know if you ever thought, oh yeah, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, I'm going to be interviewed on, what I did.
Right.
Uh, Probably not, I'm assuming. So, but definitely, the community itself is very special. And yeah, I appreciate their support of just, my series and allowing me to get out your stories and the history of the brand and what it's meant for myself, to a wider audience.
Right.
Um, as a marketer, it's of course important to have a range of influences and inspirations. Where did you draw your inspiration from, and who's been your biggest influences throughout your career?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, my inspiration came, I think, from early days, seeing my dad work in the model shop and, my interest in marketing and sales and my start in retail. But I'd have to say, my biggest influences, at least early in my career at Hasbro, as a marketer at Hasbro, two names really come to mind as being big. And I've said it earlier, Kirk Bazigian, worked closely with Kirk early on when Kirk was in direct marketing and I was in marketing research. And then, closely with Kirk throughout my tenure with GI Joe and WWF. It's been a great inspirational for me teacher of marketing and continues to be a good teacher of marketing. As we all know, he's teaching at Providence College as well as a marketing professor. So I would say Kirk Bazigian, definitely inspirational as a marketer to me throughout my career. And, as many of you know, Don Levine was known for being the grandfather of GI Joe, Don Levine at Hasbro. Then Kirk has to be the grandson, right, of GI Joe. If Don Levine's the grandfather, then Kirk's got to be the grandson. In early days working with Kirk has just been terrific. I think the second one in the toy industry, kind of later in my career at Hasbro, not on GI Joe, but with the Play School, is I worked with a woman by the name of Meg Whitman. We reported to Meg. For those of you who remember Meg or know the name, she was the GM, general manager on Play School, and I reported as one of the marketing directors to Meg. She became the CEO of eBay and became obviously one of the richest women in the world at one point when she took the company public and I think ran for governor of California. And so from a brand marketing perspective, I think Meg Whitman was very inspirational in my career at Hasbro on the second part off of boys' toys, but then again, just in general in marketing. So I think those were two of the big names that kind of stuck out in my mind as being true leaders that I learned a lot from and will always hold dear to my heart.
Yeah, and then I mean, Kirk's awesome, and we've all had several discussions all together and stuff, and I know that the unique thing about him that everybody's always shared is like he was kind of just everywhere, floating around and stuff like that. And yeah, I didn't realize I didn't realize you worked directly with Meg, so it's interesting to hear that connection with that and eBay. No discounts on eBay, right? I mean, as far as
no discounts on eBay. And
being able to sell.
I think then she went to HP, I think, too, for a while.
Okay.
Yeah, but the story, like you just hit on something. So the stories, yeah, when Kirk, as you know, was on Boys Toys for quite a while, then left and worked in Play School. I was on GI Joe at the time. Kirk would stop by my office daily, say, "Swanee, what's going on with GI Joe? What's there on your desk?" He'd always be interested, obviously, and passionate about GI Joe and what was going on with GI Joe. And so he'd always just, because all marketing was together, even though it was Boys Toys, Girls Toys, Play School, preschool, Kirk would stop by the office and always be interested in seeing what was going on and what we were working on GI Joe. So that was that's again the close knit kind of camaraderie that we all had together in those days.
And that trust, even though he wasn't, and I'm assuming, it wasn't like oh my gosh, here he comes again. He's checking in on me, but it's like you knew the passion that he had for the brand itself. So it was more, I'm assuming it was more welcoming than, how it can be. Somebody's just hovering over, like, what are you guys doing with this? You're not getting annoyed, I'm assuming,
Exactly.
with him coming by. So,
yep.
Last question I had, what influenced you from Hasbro that you've taken away and still incorporate in your daily life today?
It's interesting you say that. I think the biggest thing as I look back, and those were early days, so I was young and naive in a lot of ways, but I think be true to yourself and believe in yourself because you are your biggest fan. So for those of you who, no matter what you're doing in your career, be true to yourself and be passionate about what you're doing. And ultimately, you're going to look back on that and think, boy, that was some great times. Because I certainly do for my time at Hasbro, and I think that's one thing that I try to incorporate in every day is believe in yourself, and the world and the future is your biggest opportunity.
I think that's great advice, and many of I've heard have shared Hasbro University in a sense. Many of you came out of college, and that was like your first quote unquote real job, right? For many of you, and so it really taught you a lot of lessons, back then, and that you've been able to. And you're retired now, so you're happily retired.
Yes.
So that's awesome, and I'm hoping that you're enjoying that as well. Well, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate we finally got connected. Bob and I talked about this for a while, and just timing, and then the books, and then life in general. Probably my side more than your side. You're retired, but I do appreciate you coming on and sharing these this great insight as to who you are and what your role was on GI Joe, and just in general the marketing. Just marketing in general. What part you had in it as far as Hasbro itself. So I appreciate you coming on. And again, I hope to have you on again, and maybe we'll expand upon some of these other toy lines, whether it be WWE or WWF or even Air Raiders, because I don't know much about Air Raiders. So that'd be kind of a fun topic to touch upon in the future. And maybe you could talk about some of the future plans. I'm assuming there were some ideas, maybe longevity, like, okay, here's series 1. And then, future series, I'm sure you have some stuff that you can potentially share out. So
sure. Yeah.
Again, thanks for coming on. And everybody, I thank everybody for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed this inside look of Bob's career and what he shared. And hope you come back for future interviews. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone.